My name is Sarah Collins, and I'm a TFA associate finishing my second year at La Trobe High School in Northwest Tasmania. And I wonder if you might allow me to indulge in a small bit of storytelling before we officially begin. Casting my mind back to the TFA selection process, I was asked to bring an item to my interview that had personal meaning and be ready to share a story about it. I selected a photo of my best friend Christopher, the same one you can see on the current slide, and I talked about how he'd attended a grand total of 22 low socioeconomic schools and lived in 46 houses by the time we met in our early 20s. His background had not been easy, but despite the odds, he was the most literate person I knew. In fact, he was the person who inspired me to write, simply by sharing his incredible everyday stories on what was a very early iteration of a blog. I think it was about 2002. It amazed me that his background didn't define him, but rather shaped his perspective and fueled his creativity in a way that I'd never encountered in a person before. I remember thinking that if I was lucky enough to get into TFA, I wanted to teach students to turn negative into positive like Christopher had. I also remember being asked what issues I thought needed to be addressed in the current educational crisis, and I spoke about the alarming statistic that 48% of Tasmanians were functionally illiterate. How I'd thought that must have been a typo, and yet when I looked into it, the statistic was probably worse. Granted, Tasmanian literacy rates have been steadily declining in the decade following that research. I ended my interview being asked the following question: if you could change anything about education, what would it be? And I answered by saying, I wish the arts were valued more and seen as a critical way to engage students in underperforming schools. It's funny how things come full circle. Here I am now at the end of my TFA journey, and my personal impact project has featured all four of these things: story sharing to build connection, a deep focus on literacy and the arts, and my students have worked with a professional writer to improve their literacy skills, who just happens to be the person that taught me to write, my best friend Christopher. Welcome to my personal impact project. Moving through my presentation, I will discuss the research with regard to school and class context, provide a comprehensive analysis of the findings, and discuss implications of my findings and next steps. My initial project proposal was to increase passion for literacy and measure vocabulary improvements in my Year 8 literacy enrichment class through community-based storytelling across written and spoken literacy exercises. I'd identified that literacy was not just a problem at school, but in the wider community, and I wanted my students to engage their caregivers in learning new words as well. However, at the end of term 2, just 3 weeks after the initial proposal was finalised, the subject of literacy enrichment was completely cut from our school, following evidence that it was no longer best practice. Starting from term 3, elements of literacy enrichment were absorbed into the subject of English, and since I don't teach English, I lost all my students and early data, which had been the focus of my impact project. Whilst the proposal was no longer viable in its original form, it was possible to adapt certain parts of my research question to tackle literacy issues within another subject. The storytelling aspect of the project, which was implemented in order to increase passion for words, had been working incredibly well. 57% of my students at the time said that storytelling was the thing that helped them learn words best. So I recognised that it would be quite a good fit for the subject of drama. At the same time, improving connections between parents and caregivers has been a school-wide focus this year. And I noticed that in drama, there were rarely, if ever, any parents at meetings scheduled, particularly in Year 7, where it's a taster subject. Finally, I've noticed that oral communication skills are quite low across the school and wanted to address that as a matter of urgency. My revised research question therefore became: to what extent does drama-based storytelling impact literacy development, student communication skills, and increase connection with caregivers and community in early years high school education? La Trobe High School is located on the northwest coast of Tasmania, with the catchment zone spanning from surrounding farming communities up to 30 minutes away. Over half the school population are from low socioeconomic backgrounds. 15% of students identify as Aboriginal, and 1% have a language background other than English. La Trobe's ICSE value is 948, with 49% of families falling into the bottom quarter of socio-educational attainment. From 2019, the La Trobe municipality was deemed the second fastest growing area in Tasmania. Student numbers increased by over 200 students in 4 years. Then, from the start of COVID through to 2024, attendance decreased from 92% to 81.6%. However, my 7D drama class is an anomaly, with a 90% average daily attendance in 2024. Another factor I've recently considered is our La Trobe High School Student Wellbeing and Engagement Survey, which revealed our lowest wellbeing scores in the school were in music and the arts, which gave further credence to the urgency of my research. Because I only started with this class in late July, I relied on the most recent student assessments for my preliminary findings, those being in English, PAT testing, and NAPLAN results, with the latter being the launching point from which all writing samples were measured. My thinking here was that NAPLAN is a best effort test. The stimulus is the same for every student. It's assessed without bias and marked against a rubric of 10 different areas. And furthermore, the typed writing samples of each student can be accessed online and therefore were readily available at the start of the project. My project sought to use the research to qualitatively and quantitatively ascertain the benefits of multiliteracy pedagogies to enhance literacy and communication skills, with particular emphasis on decreasing Tier 1 vocabulary words and growing Tier 2 vocabulary. Students' NAPLAN writing samples were then analysed by me for the rate of Tier 1, 2 and 3 vocab words, the desired goal being that students would hopefully decrease their use of Tier 1 words and increase their use of more nuanced Tier 2 and 3 vocabulary through narrative-driven learning, visualised learning processes, reflective techniques, use of symbols and metaphors, scaffolded skill mastery by working with a professional writer, connectedness to community, as well as gestural, spatial, and linguistic multiliteracy communication modes throughout the story writing process. I then designed a unit where students would have to work directly with their caregivers, collaborating on a true story that was part of their family folklore, which they would first listen to, then discuss verbally with the class before writing it down and performing it to their families in Term 4. This process of listening first, collaborating with families second, was chosen because, as McKeon and Beck assert, using read aloud events to promote vocabulary learning aligns with a language development perspective, which holds that exposure to and an interaction with language in natural settings is the key to literacy development. Students also worked with a New York-based professional writer, Christopher Weldon, whose own family tale was the initial example students were given on which to model their stories. This was one of the strategies in my initial project that thankfully stayed the same. De-identified first drafts were sent through to Chris for open-ended feedback or ways students could enhance their writing, which they then implemented in the following lesson. I instructed Christopher to ask questions that opened up the possibilities for their vocab and descriptive language to expand, as opposed to telling them exactly what to write. This allowed us to be a guide rail to student learning rather than the sole dictators, where all knowledge in the classroom should begin and end. Despite the original subject I was teaching being cut school-wide in late July, which altered the timeline, year group, and subject area of the project, as well as my research question, the basis of what I was trying to find out did not alter. I used the constructivist paradigm as the framework for my project, understanding that it was the model that best suited my learning issue and core beliefs, that students should actively create, interpret, and reorganize knowledge in individual ways. It also recognizes that young people have a deeper capacity for engagement when they encounter strategies which emphasize student involvement in learning, focusing on knowledge building instead of knowledge transmission. Research has also shown how a constructivist approach uses interaction as a key strategy for knowledge construction, as opposed to simply knowledge acquisition. There is an authenticity to this learning style, which asks students to bring their own life experiences to the classroom and to share these with others to facilitate further learning opportunities, which worked remarkably well with students' family stories. An analysis of the quantitative findings shows that from their preliminary NAPLAN writing samples through to final drafts of their life stories, student word count and tiers of vocabulary developed dramatically. The graph in Appendix 5 shows that while the students' average word count increased between the NAPLAN essay and the final draft of their personal story, the most significant change was between their NAPLAN essay and their personal story's first draft. This could be attributed to the tendency of students to become more expressive when tapping into stories and situations that they have a deeper connection to, while some students saw a reduction in the word count of their first draft. This was generally counted during the editing phase, with the largest first and final draft percentage increases coming from these students. Conversely, one student with an overly wordy first draft saw their word count come down during the editing phase. Despite the general upward trend, there was significant difference between the students' word count account variations reflected in standard deviations between NAPLAN Draft 1 and the final draft percentage changes of 74, 30 and 75% respectively. While the average use of Tier 1 words increased by just 2% in Appendix 6, between the students' NAPLAN essays and the first draft of their personal stories, the use of Tier 2 words dropped by 16%. This is largely due to students commonly using more everyday words when first telling a story that may have been told many times in their family, or when recounting a conversation that in itself did not involve many Tier 2 words. Interestingly, though, the largest change was in the use of Tier 3 words, with a 33% increase. While this could be attributable to the low base of Tier 3 words in the NAPLAN essays, it could also be due to the students deciding to use a few larger words to spice up their more simply told personal stories. Based on the Appendix 7 chart, we can see the significant impact of the editing phase on the use of Tier 2 words, with a 70% increase between the first and final drafts of their personal stories. While this was in part due to the increased word count between the two drafts, it was also due to the upward conversion of simpler Tier 1 words and the downward conversion of more technical Tier 3 words, with a 10% decrease in both data sets. As you can see from this chart, the majority of students decreased their use of Tier 1 words between their NAPLAN essay and the final draft of their personal story, while dramatically increasing their use of Tier 2 words and significantly increasing their use of Tier 3 words. The overall difference was a 9% decrease in Tier 1 and 42% increase in Tier 2, and a 22% increase in Tier 3. While the standard deviation is less than 6% for the change in Tier 1 words, it went up to 26% and 78% for Tier 2 and 3 words respectively. However, for Tier 3, this was in effect the difference between some students using 2 words instead of 3, and others going from 2 Tier 3 words to 4. The difference in students' Tier 2 use is largely attributable to greater application during the editing phase. Importantly, any student who saw a drop in Tier 3 word use saw an increase in Tier 2 words, revealing a greater understanding that bigger and more technical words are not always the most appropriate when trying to tell a compelling story. Quantitative data findings, which took in classroom observations and engagement towards the unit, student self-efficacy feedback at the culmination of the project, and interactions with parents and caregivers over the course of the unit showed major increases in all areas, from student pride to finding which storytelling techniques worked best, to the self-assessment of skills gained at the end of the unit. Students developed in ways that they may not recognise immediately, but will hopefully continue to help them further down the track. Of particular note, 90% of students collaborated with their families to write their stories, which translated to a profound turnaround in the number of families connecting to their child's education at La Trobe High School through the subject of Year 7 drama, which I observed and experienced firsthand through reading their stories and being contacted or stopped for a yarn like never before by parents, who seemed to also have a newfound confidence and, dare I say, a little glint in their eye as they approached me, usually saying something like, "You teach my child in Year 7 drama. Oh my goodness, did we have fun going through the family stories?" Or, "My kid nearly had us on the ground with laughter at dinner the other night with that boat story." And many students had a range of feedback in terms of what they got out of the unit. In conclusion, my research question of to what extent does drama-based storytelling impact literacy development, student communication skills, and increased connection with caregivers and community in early years high school education can be answered by keen observation of the quantitative data that has been collated, showing huge growth in Tier 2 vocab, which can be argued is the most important tier in high school literacy development, and certainly when it comes to creative writing and personal storytelling. The leap students made in their clarity of ideas, descriptive language, and love for writing was clear. And whilst I'm immensely proud of this project and the growth that can be seen in the data that has been presented, it's the qualitative data that speaks to me the most as a teacher who came to Tasmania to tackle literacy issues, and particularly wanted to explore why students were experiencing profound disengagement in language arts. The gains that students made in their communication skills perhaps is most evident in the fact that 90% of students work diligently with their caregivers to ask questions about, listen to, and transcribe family stories, bringing them back to class, remembering details, performing certain parts for their classmates, and working with an editor to hone their final piece of work. There have been limitations with my project, obviously starting with the loss of student data halfway through the journey and a slight bias towards anecdotal evidence with regard to parent interactions. However, both stages of the project taught me that when students write about what they know and when they collaborate with their families and communities to share lived experiences, the data tells us that vocabulary, descriptive language, and word count tends to soar, which underscores the idea that human actions can never be separated from past experience, which inevitably contributes to an individual's worldview. Moving forward, there is a limitation also with one of the most key pieces of the unit, which was the students being able to work with a professional writer to help hone their writing. Unfortunately, unless there's a budget allocated, it would be very difficult for future teachers and students to do this part of the project, which I was able to call in a favour for. Perhaps there's an opportunity to work with community members or seek a workshopping opportunity with a creative or our La Trobe High School parent body. This project has helped shape the worldview of some of my students to such a profound degree that there is every intention of continuing this unit for the Year 7 drama students moving forward. I intend to observe the progress of this cohort in the longer term and to look for any continued benefits of our time working together as they navigate their high school lives. Above all, I hope that the proof is in their passion. Thank you.